What's up guys, Agent here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be going over which jewelry trait's going to be best for a DPS. That's going to be between Infused and then either Arcane or Robust, depending on if you're Magicka or Stamina DPS. We will not be touching upon Bloodthirsty today, just because Bloodthirsty does involve a little bit more complex mathematics behind it in order to kind of determine which one's going to be better, along with the fact that Bloodthirsty would have to be compared to Arcane Robust as well as Infused, as well as the various combinations of Bloodthirsty that you might end up playing with. So Bloodthirsty is going to be reserved for a separate video that'll be coming out in a few days here. I just need to go over the mathematics, make sure everything sort of makes sense and that the comparisons are valid. So for this video, we're just looking at Arcane/Robust and compare that to Infused. So we already did a video on this a little bit earlier when Summerset first released and we had these new jewelry traits come out. So the jewelry traits that we're specifically talking about are going to be Arcane Robust, which is basically just increases your max resources, Magicka for Arcane, Stamina for Robust, and Infused. If you go over to a transmute station, we'll find that Infused basically acts the exact same way as Infused on a weapon does or on an armor piece does. And basically what it does is it increases the effectiveness of your spell of your enchant. So you can see here that our base enchant is 174, but when we infuse it, we gain 104 additional spell damage here. So back when Summerset was first released and we had received word that Infused would be increasing our jewelry enchant effectiveness by 60%, a few people went ahead and did the math, myself included, and basically said that Arcane is generally going to be a little bit better than Infused on Magicka DPS, but Infused is going to be stronger on Stamina DPS, just due to the way that modifiers work out. So obviously max Magicka, max Stamina, you have those modifiers, and then you have weapon damage, spell damage modifiers, and you have different amounts of modifiers, and that will impact the effectiveness of Arcane versus Infused or Robust versus Infused for Magicka or Stamina DPS respectively. So we're revisiting this today because in Murkmire they did change the strength of minor Brutality and minor Sorcery. So that is the buff to your weapon damage and spell damage. Before Murkmire it was a 5% boost, but now in Murkmire it is now a 10% boost. So we're gonna have to kind of re-examine this, see whether or not that additional boost to spell damage, specifically for Magicka DPS, pushes Infused ahead of Arcane. So we're just going to be covering basically all different modifiers, kind of the basis behind the mathematics, and then we'll go straight into the mathematics so you guys can get a sense of which one is actually going to be stronger. Again, we're not touching upon Bloodthirsty because that mathematic is going to be a little bit more complex, and there's also a couple of things that I want to touch upon with Bloodthirsty that I don't really have time to cover in this video. So first of all, we went over Infused and we went over Arcane. The first thing that you're going to have to know about this particular comparison is the fact that we're going to be looking at the maximum effective Magicka that you're able to obtain from either Arcane or Infused, or if you're talking about Stamina DPS, obviously Stamina versus Infused. And that's important just because we kind of want to have two comparable metrics. Basically we want the metrics to be exactly the same, so we can either go with spell damage or max Magicka. I decided to go with max Magicka just because it just made a little bit more sense to go that way. So the first thing we're going to be going over are what are all the various modifiers that you have for your max resources as well as your weapon damage and spell damage. So we're going to hop over to our Mundus comparison calculator, our trusty little calculator here, which has been updated with all of the new changes that have been made in Murkmire. So I will have a link down in the description below to a link to a copy of this. You will have to make a copy for yourself in order to edit it. So this link down below is going to be read only. You will have to save a new copy in order to use it for yourself. So we're on a Magicka DPS right now. So one thing I will take note of here is that this particular calculator does not include the 20% bonus to your max resources from champion points. So when you hit 100 CP into your blue CPs or your green CPs, you get 20% additional Magicka or Stamina. So that this particular calculator does not take that into consideration. But when we do the mathematics, we will include that into our math in the end. So for Magicka, you have a fair amount of modifiers here. You have Warhorn, which is 10%. Racial passes range anywhere from 10% to 0%, depending on your specific race. Inner Light gives you 5%. Magicka Controller passive gives you additional 2% for every Magicka ability you have, Mage's Guild ability you have slotted. Undaunted Metal gives you 2% for each armor weight equipped, and most Magicka DPS have 3 different armor weights, 5 light, 1 medium, 1 heavy, so that's 6%. Then there are a couple of class-specific modifiers here, so we'll go over each of these specifically just because they're all 8%. So Nightblades have Magical Flood passive, Wardens have the Northern Storm ultimate, and then Sorcerers have the Devout Aegis ability as well. So we'll do one with the 8% and then one without the 8% just to kind of get a little bit of a comparison there. Then for our spell damage modifiers for Magicka DPS, there's really not that many. You have Major Sorcery and Minor Sorcery, which is 20 and 10% respectively, and then you have Expert Mage passive under Source, which is a 2% bonus for each Sorc ability you have slotted. So when we go over spell damage modifiers, again, we'll be looking at without Sorcs and then with Sorcs. So your typical Sorc build will have anywhere between 3 to 4 Sorc abilities on their front bar, and we're only going to be looking at front bar here because that's where you're doing your spam build most. So you're going to be on your front bar the most often. So we'll just use 6%. So we have 3 Sorc abilities on our front bar. We have Frags, Bound Aegis, and Endless Fury there. So that's for Magicka. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Stamina. Stamina has different modifiers here. So for our multipliers for our max stam, same thing, we have Warhorn, Racial Passives, and Undaunted Metal, but you'll see that we don't really have anything equivalent to Inner Light for Stam DPS. The only other modifier we have is for Stam Sorcs with their Bound Armaments ability. Again, we'll have a comparison with and without that Bound Armaments. Then for weapon damage modifiers, you can see here Stam DPS have a lot more weapon damage modifiers than Magicka DPS have for their spell damage modifiers. You have your major amount of brutality, you have agility under your medium armor skill tree, you have flawless Dawnbreaker, which gives you 5%, then you have the Slayer passive, which gives you 3% for every fighter skill ability you have slotted. Most stamina DPS will be running rearming chop on the front bar, and obviously flawless Dawnbreaker counts, so you have an additional 6% there. Expert Mage again from Sorcs, so for Stam Sorcs, depending on your specific build, you will typically have 1 Sorc ability on your front bar, maybe 2, so we'll just go with 1, which you go with 2, which is Bound Armament and Hurricane. Then you have Templars, which have Balanced Warriors. So again, we'll be taking a look at each of these separately because it is going to be a little bit different for each class. However, that being said, though, you can clearly tell already that Infused definitely has a huge advantage for Stam DPS just because you have way more weapon damage modifiers as a Stamina DPS compared to Magicka DPS. So now if we go ahead and swap over to our trusty little calculator R, I will blow up the console here so you guys can have a better look at it. So basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be converting everything to effective max magicka or effective max stamina. So for something like Infused, where we only have an increase in weapon damage or spell damage, we're going to multiply everything after our modifiers by 10.5. That's the general ratio between spell damage and max magicka, or I should say max resources and weapon or spell damage. Every 10.5 max magicka is equivalent to 1 effective spell damage or weapon damage, so that's basically that's where that 10.5 comes from. So starting off first with Arcane without that 8% modifier across the different classes. So we have 870, and then we basically have to add in our modifiers. So we add in our 20% from our CP passives, and then we add in 10% from Warhorn. We add 9% for our Dark Elves. You can go with High Elves if you'd like. High Elves or Bretons, they both have 10%, but 0.1 versus 0.09 is a pretty small difference, so it doesn't really matter which one we use ultimately. It's not really going to affect our results, basically. Then we have our Inner Light, and then we have our Major Skills passive there, Magicka Controller, and then we have our Undaunted passive, which is our 6% because we have 5 light, 1 medium, 1 heavy. What did I do? Oh, I did plus rather than multiply. That's an error on my part there. So we have 1322.4 is our effective max magicka that we're getting with all of our modifiers. And then we're going to take a look at Infused. So Infused adds 104 on top of our spell damage enchant already, the 174. So we have 104, and then we want to multiply that by our modifier. So again, we're assuming that we're not a Sorc, so 0.2 and 0.1 for major and minor sorcery. So that gives us 135, and we multiply this by 10.5. That gives us 1419.6. So we can see here that Infused is going to be stronger for any class that doesn't have that 8% additional max magicka bonus here. So if we do include that 8% max magicka bonus, so we just add another 0.08 here, we get 1392. So we can see here that's even with that additional 8%, Infused still ends up winning out compared to Arcane. So the difference is just going to be significantly smaller as a result here. So if we take a look at the percentage wise, so we have, I need to put this under parentheses actually, minus 1322.4, and we divide it by 1322.4 times 100. That's a difference of about 7.3%. And then if we assume that we are a Sorc or a Nightblade, we have 1392, and that's a little bit smaller, about a 2% increase overall. Now we do also want to take into consideration, what if we're a Sorc? So if we just add in our additional 6% here as a Sorc, 1485, it obviously just pushes it a little bit greater, so the difference is going to be a little bit greater if you're a Magicka Sorc this way. So for Arcane versus Infused for Magicka DPS, Infused is going to win out by a small margin here, 7 to 2%, something like that. One thing that I do want to mention here though is that Arcane does give you more resources. Magicka DPS generally have a little bit more difficult time sustaining compared to stamina DPS, because you only have 2 weapon enchants compared to 3 for stamina DPS. A lot of Magicka DPS right now are having to rely on absorb Magicka enchants and maybe even using something like spell symmetry in order to sustain a full light attack rotation even in raids with support with worm and orbs. So that's something you want to keep in consideration there too. You have more resources with Arcane, which means you have a greater resource pool, which means it's going to take longer in order to completely exhaust that. So that's just something you want to keep in mind there. The difference for me is small enough that you can arguably justify running Arcane versus Infused, but if you're looking to push out the most amount of DPS and you're able to sustain that full light attack rotation, then Infused is going to be the stronger choice here. Now, what about stamina DPS? So I'm going to do the exact same thing for stamina DPS. So we have 870. Add in our CP passive, and then we add in Warhorn. Red guards have 10%, so we're going to add in 0.1 there. Now for undaunted passives, there's basically 2 options that most stamina DPS can go for. They can go with all medium, which is 7 medium, or they can go with 6 medium, 1 heavy. So I personally go 6 medium, 1 heavy, so that's what we're going to be using for this assumption here. So it's going to be an additional 4% there, and that's basically it for our max stamina modifier. So we get 1252.8. And then we look at our infused modifier. So we have 1, and then we add in minor brutality and major brutality. Then we add in our flawless dawnbreaker. We add in 6% for our slayer. Again, we have rearming trap and flawless dawnbreaker, 3% each, so that's 6%. Then we add in agility, which is another 15%, and then that's pretty much it. We're not assuming we're a Sorc or a Templar right now. That gives us 162, and multiply that by 10.5, and as you can imagine, it's much greater compared to what Robust can even begin to offer us. So 1703.52 minus 1252.8 divided by 1252.8 times 100, and we can see we have about a almost 36% increase in effective max stamina that we're getting with Infused compared to Robust. Let me just double check, make sure I didn't miss any modifiers here. I don't believe I did. No, I did not. So we just have to redo this again with Sorcs. So we're assuming that we have our additional 0.08 here. That gives us 1322. But again, if we are a Sorc, then we also have additional 0.4 here. So it's still going to be greater. Infused is still going to be strongest for stamina DPS. The change to minor brutality just increased the gap even more there. So in terms of which George enchant that you're going to want on your DPS, looks like Infused is going to win out if you're just trying to compare between Arcane or Robust and Infused. Again, this does not include Bloodthirsty. That'll be in a separate video just because the mathematics are a little bit more involved, and I don't want to turn this into like a 25-minute long video or anything like that. So be on the lookout for that. That should be coming out in the next couple of days. Now, for those of you guys who prefer to read a more written guide, I do have a description down in the description below. I do have a link to Tabitha's website. She basically did the exact same mathematics that I did here, except she obviously wrote it out, and she does include things like charts, so that way it's a little bit easier to visually compare the 2 scenarios there. She also does it for a solo scenario versus a group scenario as well. Her results are pretty much more or less in line with what I have here. Magicka Nightblades in her results did end up having Arcane being a little bit stronger, but the difference there is pretty minimal. So overall, Infused is still going to be the strongest trait if you're just looking at Arcane, Robust versus Infused. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. you guys have any questions, please free them down in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.